Well, welcome everyone to this video of a emergent conversation around a topic that the three of us involved here are very passionate about, that being the 8 patterns of open business agility. And one thing that in our pre-conversation we were just talking about, and Victor brought up that, well, what makes this different? What is this? What is this 8 patterns? Why is it different? And why should someone else care? And so, Victor, you started there. What would your answer be? What's your response to someone who says, "Well, why? How is this not just some other framework that, why should I care?"
Yes. Oh, thanks, Ryan. Well, these are the questions we get often, all the time, right? Talking about the 8 patterns, whether in these Scrum gatherings or conferences or other teaching material, is what are patterns, right? How is that different than, the models and the frameworks that are so often advertised by other providers, and how is it implemented? Is it just another way to phrase or to frame principles, and I think the easiest analogy that comes across in communicating with folks in the agile space around what patterns are is we often talk about anti-patterns, right? We talk about dysfunctions that companies may exhibit that's impeding them in enterprise agility or team agility. And patterns will be the exact opposite, right? It's what supports enterprise agility, supports team agility. So what are the things that we are doing as an enterprise that's helping it become agile? And so I think that's well expressed in the 8 patterns, and especially so in the 8 patterns diagram, is if we do follow them in some shape or form in how the organization behaves, then it gives us a good shot at actually being agile as an enterprise or as a team or even as an individual. So yes, that's my take on it. And I'll invite Markus to share his thoughts on this as well. Thank you.
Yes, I think the 8 patterns actually, or patterns in general, they leave space for your context. So they respect your context and they value your context. And this helps you actually to discover your agility within a given context. And I would say this is one of the main differences when we talk about working towards patterns or working towards practices. And I think this is the power of the 8 patterns, that they are organized around the main activity or the main pattern of inviting leadership. So you're, let's say, you're guiding your own change. You decide what you want to do, but the patterns give you guidance actually toward your real desired outcomes or your real desired transformation goals. And I think it gives you the freedom to do exactly what makes sense in your specific context. And I think this is one of the most powerful aspects of the patterns. And instead of designing work systems for people, it invites people to design their work systems towards the sustainability. And I would say this is why the 8 patterns are so powerful actually, and can be applied so easy, because you can start where you are basically.
Yes.
That it brings up an image for me that in the class, that there's a bridge, that the patterns serve as a bridge between values and principles and practices, right? So it's a way to traverse the path towards the figuring out why we do something and what we want to do, and the actual how of the practice. Well, there's many ways that you can traverse that path, of course, and then having some, like, and Victor, so you said, having some actual patterns as opposed to anti-patterns, so some ways to navigate the path, I think is valuable. And I think, and the that core pattern, the invitation, that it all having to do with agency and invitation is so important. And inviting someone to travel along a path from the agile values and principles towards the practices of software development, and what are that there's a lot of shall we say, there can be hesitation to that, are we going the right way? So that bridge, that's just what came to me again, thinking of hearing both you talk about what is the bridge. And we have the inviting leadership, the invitation, the leadership invitation bridge. Beyond that, as the keystone, either of you, what would be the next pattern that you would want to bring forth as what's your next favorite pattern?
Beautiful question. Thanks, Rijon. And yes, I think it's exactly on point. One of the it's actually often asked as well of students of 8 patterns and the other open leadership network courses. Which other patterns would best support enterprise agility and not just leadership invitation? If we look at the 8 patterns, right, in its totality, it's almost like it's a tapestry that's weaved together, all of these patterns, and it's almost impossible to separate them in a way that makes them logically independent of one another. And I give some examples which I think again are what I think, at least in my experience, are important impediments, and also what would allow enterprise agility, that being explicit agreements, boundary management, and clarity of authorization. In my view, at least, these 3 would be the most important. And the reason for that has a lot to do with what we sometimes call decision latency, especially for those of us familiar with Scrum at Scale, because poorly defined boundaries often result in people trying to push them, right? Skirmishes along the boundaries. And whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, or politically, or for whatever reason, right? That creates a lot of waste. That generates a lot of waste. It generates a lot of anti-patterns that do not help an enterprise in its journey towards agility. And often it's helpful to have, therefore, these boundaries be well articulated, well expressed, and captured as explicit agreements. Then there would therefore be clarity of authorization, right? Of course, there's a lot more to that around how we design those, which again then goes to all the empirical processes, the whole group process, and those sorts of things. But it's important to nail down the decision, or to get the organization to agree on the decision right structure of the organization, and to capture that in agreement. And that would help resolve a lot of the boundary issues that we see are often happen in what we call chaotic organizations that keep trying to push boundaries. That's my take, at least. What do you think, Markus? Thanks for the question. Great question.
Yeah. So Victor, Ryan, great question, great answer, and so I can try to add or adapt. So my thought about it. So while you were saying that this is like it's a very basic thing, actually, I thought like it's for me it's actually like it's a force, or these are forces which has to be in place. So I've seen so many transformation failed, even like the transformation was very, let's say, very clearly described, or like the actions were pretty clear, even the roles were pretty clear. But for example, having a product owner like a PO without the authorization of executing the things he needs to do, having a clash between roles like product management or product ownership. So the boundary aspect, if you don't have that in place, and if you're not aware like where the boundary starts and ends, so having this kind of explicit agreements, what are we going to do here? Having interaction protocols of making meetings much more efficient. Stop boring people with stupid things. It's really like start to design good interactions. So for me, it's like really, I can't say what is my favorite. For me, it's like, it seems that the core is the inviting aspect, but the other are surrounding everything. And I think if you don't have them in place, if you like it or not, I would say it's very likely that you're not going to achieve any kind of agility. So basically, the funny thing is it doesn't sound so agile at all to make things so explicit or to talk about boundaries. Yeah, so it's about self-managing teams. But I like what Daniel referenced on game dynamics. So a game can only work if you know the rules of the game. And this gives you speed. And the game, let's say, can only keep dynamic if people can decide for themselves within a set of rules, principles, or clarity. And this is what gives you dynamic actually in an uncertain environment. So thinking about a soccer game, it's very clearly described the rule set. So you can see the goals, like we know what we're heading for. You don't have 5 to 10 goals, like one, it's very clear. And like what is soccer field actually where you're playing. And the coach doesn't tell every individual what is the next step he has to perform. I mean, this is what companies do. This is like typical micromanagement. So like the person staying beside don't have any stakes in it, telling the people who are doing the work, like what is the next step. So imagine that in a football game, you would get a zero dynamic. And I think this is what I feel when we're talking about the patterns, that we're establishing high dynamic interactions within organizations and with being very clear and explicit. But more like some like a surrounding for us. So, I mean, I guess you can go Scrum, less safe, Nexus, whatever you want. I think if you don't have those things in place, it doesn't matter. And because they respect and value your context. And so sorry, Ryan, I can't answer your question, but I think it's, I was talking a lot, but I like every one of these patterns. It really depends on what's the current problem or the thing you want to solve it.
Exactly, it's exactly what problem you're solving. It's a trick question, kind of, because it's the patterns, and to me, what's so powerful to me, but it's a system, right? It's a system, and that each of these parts, and in the material also, it's very well stated in the materials and the teaching materials that when I looked through them and took the class and I'm reviewing them again, is that each of the 8 patterns, they have connectors to other patterns, and that they amplify each other in other ways. And I often, what has been an aha for me is that they have just these 8 components have given me a language to say, well, I think we need a leadership invitation to a group process designed to create common knowledge around explicit agreements that create a clarity of authorization and allow us to interact with one another with interaction protocols, so we can again have those explicit agreements about boundaries, boundary management, and clarity of authorization. And so just knowing what those things mean, and just, it's like a sense making thought. So okay, so for me, it provides that clarity of saying, well, of course we need clarity of authorization, right? So we need to know who decides, who's making decisions for whom, right? And well, how do we get that clarity of authorization? Well, we as a we together, well, common knowledge is important. Well, how do we get that common knowledge? Well, we get that common knowledge through invitation to a group process, right? And this also goes down into the weeds, into the game theory, right? So, well, it's about Well, we're inviting people to take part in a process, to engage in creation. It again, it's very exciting to have the ability to see how each of these 8 components interact with one another and synergize to I would say to give us hope that we can be effective in an organization, that we can achieve common knowledge, and we can have explicit agreements about who decides what, and we're good about that. When the deep code about game theory, we're opted in, right? We're invited to the process, we opt in. So I agree that I have these rights, that you have those rights, and that it just, I don't know, it's there's so much there, and again, that's why the class was so, for me individually, is so, I was so energized by it, because you can see that there's light at the end of the tunnel, I guess.
Yeah, and Ryan, I think it's what I mean, if you're thinking about the future agility, actually, I think it brings back to, let's say, where agility actually belongs to. It's the people who perform the work. So I think there have been now a decade of where, I don't know, whoever tells people how to do agility, what is agility, or like this is not agile and this might be agile. And I think at the end, basically, it harms the work system and it harms the people. And so what I feel here, actually, this is for me like a path which, yeah, brings agility back to where it belongs to. And these are, for me, people who work in organizations. So to let them design their desired work system, because it's very likely that they know best how they want to work, and that there is no right or wrong. So.
I love that description, Markus. Thank you. Bringing agility back to what it was. I think that's exactly what we get in too many agile transformation endeavors these days, right? An excessive focus on the definition of certain terms or certain frameworks or certain practices, and the endless debate and around the provocative nature of how the Scrum Guide was written and those sorts of things, right? But like, I think, Rijon, again, your summary, I think I completely agree with how you describe this as a you mentioned sense making. I think it's particularly in the sense of profiling an organization, because having cognizance around the 8 patterns at least gives us the ability to identify where some of these patterns are being expressed or not expressed in these organizations. And that's a great place to start. Even if the practice itself hasn't yet been defined, perhaps because we have not invited the individuals that are involved or impacted by the change to contribute in that regard. But we have a way of framing what needs to happen to the leadership, so that they know that these patterns need to be in place, and what will allow us, or how may we design interventions that will allow us to actually implement these patterns through practices. And like Markus's point, right, a lot of that is the decision of the workers, right? The work context, the people involved in delivering the knowledge work has the most say around how and what these practices should be. And I think the 8 patterns are a great way for us to profile an organization.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I think I wish I had access to the patterns and around the power of the practices as they organized into those patterns, right? So the group process, for example, and open space technology being a big part of that. And when you say open space technology could have solved this problem, to some folks, it just it goes. What is open technology space? What? But being able to say, well, we have this huge, and for me in the past, a project I was on, there was a large effort to do a post-merger integration system. So, and that there was wide variety of requirements and understanding of business processes around several lines of business, and that, and it felt just like I knew that the way that these workshops were being conducted through time, it was ineffective. There was vast disengagement. The people just didn't care. There was 150 people in this hotel room, just staring at a screen. Another 50 or 100 people dialed in on conference calls, and it's just, how on earth do you think this is going to be effective? And what does effectiveness mean? Well, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to create common knowledge, right? We're trying to say, well, this is the process we have. This is where we are. This is where we're going. Is there understanding among the groups? And that if you say, well, I don't know, let's put it on the board and walk through it. And had I access to the patterns back then, I would have said, well, if we want to do this workshop is an ideal place to use open space, right? It would be an ideal way to use open space, and for many, and I guess, oh, we need a group process, right? Well, what kind of group process? Well, this is a way we can do it. And it would have been nice to have taken that 150 people and given them a theme, allowed them to choose what was most important to them, and break out into the sessions in ways that made sense to them for the topics that were most relevant to them, and to reconvene, make sense of it together, to share, document the results, and go forward in a second day. So just, and think, boy, there's and those are just that's one practice within the pattern landscape. And then accelerating upon that, and again, taking back this project, well, what if, because this was a 5-year project, it wasn't going to stop with that one open space. Well, how do we inspect and adapt and achieve transparency? Well, through an empirical approach. Well, what does an empirical approach mean? It means taking an event, doing an experiment, looking at the results, right? And that's and being able to explain that as a pattern, that this is something that this is a positive pattern, that if you're just letting it go and just let workshops just die on the vine, well, that's not very empirical. That's not an intentional approach. But again, I wish I could turn back time and say, well, why we could have run that several workshops as open spaces, or small open spaces, or as sprints and empirical approaches to work. I mean, so this is why I believe that the patterns are important to share, and important to spread the word about, because it's connecting the dots, right? It's not just hey, go do Scrum and do this, and just do a PI planning event and blah blah blah. No, well, what is a PI planning event? What is that for? And what does an effective PI planning event What are the parts of that? Well, to be effective, there ought to be some invitation to that, and then what's the purpose of it? An invitation to a group process to create common knowledge, and it's just, boy, the power of the pattern language is compelling, and more people need to know it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, and I would say, sorry, Glenn, and I say that, so I've did this in practice, we've implemented SAFe with an open space agility cycle. This was true magic. I mean, it's totally valid, because suddenly you let the people decide what they want to do and what not. It's like, okay, do we want to do this PI planning? Yeah, there's a recommendation. Let's adjust this, let's tweak it. No, we don't need this. But so while we're talking, Ryan, I understood actually that, so there's always agility is claiming that if you're not going agile, you might miss out innovation. But I think that the true threat for companies nowadays, that the topic of, or actually going with imposed agility, I think this is the real threat, rather than missing out innovation, because this is what I observe currently. Imposed agility is killing companies. And what I'm going to expect is, like, there will be a huge wave, like, where companies get rid of this stuff, take over their control, throw out all the consultancy, and say, now we're taking over our own agility. It's like we were blind, we didn't understand, and we could spend it much better. I mean, you have to look at the real big and innovative players. They're not claiming that they're using any framework, because they're solving the topic for themselves, because they take it serious. So agility is not some kind of state or transformation or whatever you can achieve. It's a capability. And to gain capabilities, you have to step into action, and you have to train it, become better, and you have to want it, and you have to take it serious. And so I'm going to expect a total new age of agility. Actually, I mean, this sounds not very, very epic, but this is really what I feel, that it feels real. So Daniel is talking about the agile industry complex. It's also what I feel. And somehow I got the feeling that currently it's ruining companies rather than helping them, because it's imposed. And I think this is especially where the 8 patterns can make a real difference. So when you think about introducing agility in your context, which really fits, is suitable and sustainable, or if you want to, let's say, fix some really weird going, I won't call it transformation, but yeah, going in the direction of agility, I think the 8 patterns can really make a difference. So this is also something where you were talking right now, like things connected, and I understand suddenly.
Yes, it brings the passion. When your eyes are opened, it's like, wow, this is powerful stuff. So speaking of an eye-opening moment, okay, I'm talking about my class, and my eyes were open. Would either of you be willing to share what opened your eyes? There was a moment in your professional lives where you didn't know what the 8 patterns were all about, or inviting leadership and the core work around that. And there was a point when you did, and you said, I care enough about this that I believe in it, that I want to share it with others, and I want to teach it. So either of you, if you'd be willing to share a story, our viewers would love to see it.
Well, that's a big question. Can I go first, Markus? Thank you. So yeah, I was first exposed to the 8 patterns some time ago, even prior to the OLN, the formation of the OLN, through another of our colleagues, Stuart. I remember feeling a sense of relatableness, if there's such a word, to the experiences that I've had during the days where I was still a developer. And this stemmed primarily from that, as a developer, I remember needing very much to be able to have some autonomy right? I think we all want that as knowledge workers. But what does autonomy mean to me? Or rather, what did it mean to me at that time? And when I think about it, it's really about what am I able to decide on my own without having to go to my manager or having to ask for permission. And then that, then the conversation about decision right hit me so hard at that time when I first knew about it, or, in explicit terms, what decision rights were. I didn't quite formulate my thought process that time when I was a developer or an engineer. But yeah, autonomy means that I should be able to make some decisions, right, as an engineer. And what would these decisions be? Some form of agreement has to take place around what that is, or there will be none by default, right? In a, what would you say, a standard or traditional organization. Then I started thinking from there, what were some of the things that I appreciated my managers were doing for me back then? So I appreciated that they asked me how things should be done, or if they had an intention of how things should be done, they gave me options, right? So would you like it to be done this way, or that other way? And deliberating on this a bit deeper, then especially as we start going into coaching, then we start thinking, were these options deliberately limiting by nature? How about option D, that he or she didn't offer to me at that point in time? And did that unconsciously shape my decision making around the limitations of these three options as a constraint, right? And all these things came up, and I started thinking, this is something that I should pay attention to, right? And in eventually becoming a manager myself, then it's you become cognizant of this interaction that you have with your direct reports, right? Interestingly, why would it then be a different sensation trying to stand in their shoes, and thinking from their perspective what they desire around autonomy and all those sorts of things, right? And so this is how the 8 patterns clicked for me. Yes, the whole group process, the empirical approach, all of these are integral to the to having a well-formed agile enterprise in my estimation. But even without this being possible, perhaps due to apprehension of having such a large event take place at the outset, it's at least very helpful to do these things even at the team level, right? A team agreement at its very core is a form of explicit agreement, boundary management, decision, right? That sort of thing, those sorts of things, right? And interaction protocols, right? Are we going to use Slack to communicate, for example? We do this all the time at the OLN as well, right? So I think these things are the foundation of a well-functioning team, a well-functioning organization, and a well-functioning enterprise. But yeah, that's how I got in, and that's a story that I was hoping to share. Thanks, Ryan, for giving me the opportunity.
I'm glad to hear that autonomy and authority, and those are big topics, especially here and now today. So,
yes,
I think we are at time. I do believe this has been a great discussion. I would like to continue it as we go forward. So Marcus, would you like to chime in with any final words before we cut out?
Yeah, so while Victor was talking, I was remembered back at my time. So I have the same history, software development, and I can remember like 13 years ago. So basically, like the final verse could be, I think the 8 patterns is probably one of the most natural things you can do if you're, yeah, if you are a human. So I think they're very human. So I mean, it's like really. So while we were talking, Victor, it was like, okay, yeah, we want to make, I mean, we were a small Scrum team. We want to make things explicit. It's about explicit agreements. You know, we were really thriving for high performance, but not because we're pushed to do it, because we were seeking for it. And I think if you want to establish these environments, for me, the 8 patterns is the most natural thing you can do. But 13 years ago, I didn't know about them. So thanks to Daniel, actually, I would say he formulated a way to become high performant and human. So these are for me like the 8 patterns.
Lovely.
Thanks,
Thanks, Markus.
Thank you, Marcus. I think that's a great place to pause for the moment. So thank you.